This is Jialin Yang, national editor at the New York Times. More than 1,700 journalists work at the Times. They come from all over, from Iraq to Iowa. They speak Arabic, Spanish, Korean. But there's one thing they all have in common. They've dedicated their lives to helping us understand the world. Everything the New York Times publishes starts and ends with their commitment. Times subscribers keep our journalists focused on their stories. If you're not a subscriber yet, you can become one at nytimes.com/subscribe.
Now it's time for the last word, where Zerlina Maxwell is in for Lawrence tonight. Good evening, Zerlina.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for having me. Please have a great weekend. Tonight, the call is coming from inside the House. America's democracy is under threat, and it's not from a foreign terrorist or nation. It's from our own elected officials in the Republican Party. You see, Republicans want you to believe that fundamentally something is wrong with America, that we're no longer a democracy, and it's because the left has done a bunch of terrible things that never turn out to be true upon closer inspection. They're obviously telling lies, but the problem is people believe those lies. Their base of voters believes the lies. And we've seen what happens when people believe scary, awful lies coming from Republicans. A Trump mob stormed the Capitol to stop the democratic process because the mob believed the Republican president and his enablers in Congress when they said the election was stolen. And people are still dying every single day from a virus that we have a safe and effective vaccine for because of more conservative lies. And tomorrow, right-wing extremists have planned yet another rally in front of the Capitol. This one to show support for the more than 600 insurrectionists who've been arrested for attacking the government on January the 6th. Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger said this about preparations for the event.
There have been some threats of violence associated with the events for tomorrow. We would be foolish not to take seriously the intelligence that we have at our disposal. How credible it is, how likely it is, people can make those judgments. But the fact of the matter is that we are hearing some chatter that I think it would be responsible for us to plan the way we've been planning and put the precautions in place.
The reality is this rally will probably be pretty tiny. Don't tell Donald Trump, and definitely do not show him a photograph. But precautions must still be taken. Because as we saw with the insurrection, the failure to prepare for the threat of domestic attack is deadly serious. Remington Belford, the communications director for Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, told the New York Times this week, I saw one of the members of Congress who's been pretty notorious and involved in objecting to the election certification. And I had this overwhelming feeling of, I won't say fear, but just concern and just like wanting to place distance between her and I. There are still remnants of trauma and fear that those people are still allowed to be here, and they could be plotting another one. See, that's the real fear here. That 7 months later, after the January 6th insurrection, the plotters and anti-democratic forces behind the Capitol attack are not only chastened, they're emboldened. The normalization of political violence as a reasonable option after a loss in an election is not a characteristic of a healthy democracy. The threat to our democracy continues because Republicans in Congress who incited the Trump mob are still damaging Americans' faith in the democratic process with all of their lies. And it's all in an effort to win an election. Republicans in 3 states are conducting fake partisan election audits, or as I like to say, fraudits, screaming about fraud that's not there and undermining faith in the 2020 election and elections in the future. Just this week, we saw before polls closed, Republicans in California claiming that fraud was occurring in the recall election. That hadn't even happened yet. These lies are designed to make Americans question the legitimate results of elections, and worse yet, are used as an excuse to enact voter suppression laws in the states. They're changing the rules of how votes are counted up after the fact. And they're driving anti-coup conservatives right out of the GOP. Republican Congressman Anthony Gonzalez, one of the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump over the insurrection, just announced that he's not seeking re-election because of the environment the GOP has created for him in Ohio, not just politically, but also needing extra security to protect his family from physical harm. The GOP might not win with this strategy in the short term, but we might not recover from the long-term damage. Who wants to be in a political party where you receive death threats from your own voters when you go against the extremists who are spewing hate and deadly lies? A new CNN poll finds just 21% of Republicans believe that President Biden legitimately won enough votes to be president. But no matter what they believe, he won the election. He won by 7 million votes. And it's clear Republicans, they're not going to protect our democracy. They think they have a better chance of winning if they do the exact opposite. So here's the question we're going to start with tonight. Democrats have the tools to save our democracy, and they're in the majority. They're also in the White House. But will they use the tools before it's too late? Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He served as a House impeachment manager in the second impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. He's also the author of Endgame, Inside the Impeachments of Donald Trump, which is funny to think about because there has been more than one. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman.
Zerlina, I added to the book, I had to add an S to the title. It's now Impeachments.
It's really wild also that happened in less than a year and a half's time. But that's not the point of this conversation. Congressman, how do you marginalize those leaders that are within the Republican Party who are literally feeding their base a steady diet of lies, to quote the great Jennifer Rubin?
You have to expose them for the lies that they are, so that the voters know every day that January 6th was not a peaceful demonstration. It was a violent day, and we can't let that be erased from history. And it has to also be clear, Zerlina, that tomorrow, the Republican Party, it's crazy to say this out loud in this day and age, but the Republican Party is holding a celebration for cop killers. They're celebrating cop killers tomorrow at our nation's capital. And they're doing this while police officers, over 150 of them who suffered injuries, many of them have not even yet returned to work. This would be the equivalent of having a post-September 11 vigil for the hijackers. That is what the Republican Party has reduced itself to. And the reason this is allowed to occur and the reason people show up is because a decreasing likelihood of Republican leaders to condemn rallies like this and the increase of calls for violence from within, from my own colleagues like Madison Cawthorn, who recently suggested that people may have to resort to a bloodshed to get the outcome that they want in our democracy.
Do you think that viewpoint that Madison Cawthorn communicated, that, you know, talking about political violence, do you think that that's what the GOP has accepted at this point? Do you think they're A-OK with political violence as the result of a lost election?
Their silence is complicit, makes them complicit. Their silence is telegraphing a permissive lane to the mob, who will continue to show up to events like this. People who will show up at the Capitol with a propane tank threatening to blow up the place because they're hearing from Republican leaders, from Donald Trump to Kevin McCarthy, that the election was stolen, and they believe it's a call to arms for them to take it back. But we have to recognize there's a cost to these deadly lies, and it's really two deadly lies that the Republicans are telling. The first, of course, about the election. It's the continued violence and threats of violence. There's a cost for the radicalization that the Republicans have put out there to their voters. And the other cost is the lie about vaccines. If the deaths don't concern you, then the actual monetary costs should concern you. We've spent $4.6 trillion addressing COVID. And for the unvaccinated, the Kaiser Foundation estimates that we have spent $20 billion treating the unvaccinated. So two twin deadly lies right now coming from the Republicans, literally killing us and costing us financially.
One of the questions I have is, at what point do these Republicans reach a breaking point, not just in the country, but within their own base and with their own voters? At what point is the number of sick and dead going to be too high for them to accept? And at what point will they say, no, political violence is not okay? And how would it look if they actually did that?
They're not doing that. They won't do that. And they're going to pay a price, just as they did in California this past Tuesday, because they're wildly, they're out of alignment with where everyday voters are. So I would suggest to you that while 8 in 10 Republicans believe the election was stolen and 4 in 10 believe that violence is okay, that doesn't reflect that the Republican Party is growing. I think it's shrinking and becoming more and more radical. And when you look across the battleground states in a recent poll, a majority of voters support the vaccine requirements that Joe Biden is putting in place to protect us. And they're going in the opposite direction, continuing to peddle the lie. So I think they're shrinking, and we just have to keep beating them at the ballot box.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you so much for starting us off tonight, and please have a safe weekend. Joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania. She was an impeachment manager in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, because, as we said at the top, there were two. So you have to distinguish between the two impeachments of the former president. Congresswoman, how do you marginalize the leaders within the Republican Party who are, as I said, feeding their base these lies that are sometimes resulting in political violence, but certainly resulting in sickness and death when it comes to COVID?
Good evening, Zerlina. I'm pleased to be with you, but these topics couldn't be more troubling. And of course, I'm delighted to be in the company of Eric Swalwell. He and I served as impeachment managers together on impeachment number 2. What I'm struck by this week, and I will get to your question about marginalization, but what I'm struck by this week is the image of the fencing going back up. Capitol Police are forced to put fences back up to protect us, members of Congress, our staff, and themselves from the lies that are coming from within. A lot of people might think we're putting the fences up because we have to protect ourselves from a possible attack, as we suffered on January the 6th, that I was witness to and witness victim of, frankly. But really, think about it. The image is absolutely perverse. It is the lies that are coming from within that are requiring these fences. If elected leaders, like those on the fringe, Madison Cawthorn and others, would stop the lies, we would have no need for this fencing. If leaders, Republicans, would actually call out and say, this was a free and fair election, there was absolutely no evidence of important fraud. It was a handful of cases, countable, literally, number of cases, no measurable fraud in this election. And the president is the president in a free and fair election. How do we continue to marginalize them? I think they're continuing to marginalize themselves. Eric was talking about his experience this week in California with the recall. You saw what is going on here in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania State Senate has passed legislation that would subpoena the records of 7 million voters in Pennsylvania. I happen to represent the 4th Congressional District. My Republican moderate voters are not happy about this kind of a subpoena for their personal records. I think the Republicans are doing it to themselves. It's a very, very sad set of circumstances.
Are the voters or your voters going to be able to make their voices heard on that point? Because part of the problem post-2020, as you know, is the sham audit in Arizona that's seemingly contagious, like a virus that's spreading to states like Pennsylvania, where they're trying to change the rules for how the votes are counted after the fact, changing the power of the Secretary of State in Arizona, for example. And I feel like they're going to say and do whatever they want if they implement rules that don't allow us to vote them out if we don't like that.
Well, you're absolutely right. Elections are everything. And that's what we have to do here in Pennsylvania. We have to do it all across the country. The thing that's going on here in Pennsylvania as I said, my own constituents are very, very upset about it, Democrats and Republicans, is that the Senate has said that they are hiring, they want to hire a third-party unnamed vendor who would subpoena all of our records, my records, anybody else who was a registered voter in Pennsylvania, and they would have access not just to our voter registration, they'd have access to our license numbers. They'd have access to parts of our Social Security numbers. Republicans don't like this. Democrats don't like this. It's literally un-American, unconstitutional, but it is what a shrinking Republican Party is up to. It will be up to us. It will be up to the voters to vote out such people. You know, this whole thing began 5 or 6 years ago with a lie and a wall. And here we are. I hope we are at the end of it, where we are again with a lie, the big lie, that they need to tear down and call back. It's a lie and a fence. And so it's time for this to end. Democrats are focused on something much more important. And you've seen what we've accomplished. We've helped our country recover from an economic collapse and shutdown. We kept us from the brink of any kind of a depression. And instead, we have a robust economy that is coming back with growing jobs. We are building back better as the Republicans shrink and require us to put fences up to protect our democracy.
Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, thank you so much for being here on this Friday night and for joining us. Please stay safe. Coming up, finally, a good news update in the fight against voter suppression. North Carolina judges have blocked North Carolina's voter ID law because they ruled it was intended to discriminate against Black people. That's up next.
This is Jialin Yang. I'm the national editor at the New York Times. I want to take a minute to speak about the incredible force behind everything we publish. I'm talking about our journalists. There are more than 1,700 of them at the Times, and I know enough of them to tell you that these are some of the most caring, diligent, and thoughtful people you'll ever meet. Some of them have wanted to be journalists since they were kids. Others first practiced as doctors, or trained as lawyers, or joined the military before bringing their expertise to the reporting they do today. They come from all over, from Iraq to Iowa. They speak Arabic, Spanish, Korean. But there's one thing they all have in common. They've dedicated their lives to helping us understand the world. I'm honored to call these people my colleagues because everything the New York Times publishes starts and ends with their commitment. If you're a Times subscriber, you provide the support that keeps our journalists focused on their stories. So thank you. If you're not a subscriber yet, you can become one at nytimes.com/subscribe.
Breaking news. There was a major victory this afternoon in the fight against voter suppression efforts in North Carolina. The majority of a panel of state judges blocked a Republican-backed law requiring photo ID to vote, also known as voter ID laws. And it was enacted with the unconstitutional intent to discriminate against African-American voters. The majority opinion said there wasn't evidence that Republicans who wrote the bill were motivated explicitly by racism, but it made it clear Republicans targeted Black voters with this law to suppress their votes. Because Black voters, guess what? They tend to vote heavily for Democrats. Throughout American history, the courts have considered a lot of cases that hinge on whether the harm to a particular group caused by a law is unconstitutional discrimination. The opinion even called out the Republicans for pretending the purpose of the voter ID law wasn't to suppress the votes of voters of color who don't vote for them most of the time. Quote, the Republican majority targeted voters who, based on race, were unlikely to vote for the majority party, even if done for partisan ends. That constitutes racial discrimination. So the judge is saying, oh yeah, nice try. Joining us now are Allison Riggs, co-executive director and chief counselor for voting rights. It's the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the group that brought the lawsuit, and Democratic North Carolina State Senator and Deputy Minority Leader Gladys Robinson. Allison, I'll start with you. The judges point out that race and politics are deeply intertwined in North Carolina. Quote, in close elections and in an era of divided state government, polarization along racial lines has made access to the ballot box a critical issue. This most recent expansion of African-American political participation has been met with facially neutral laws enacted by Republican majorities and designed to constrain African American political power. Unpack that for us. Talk to us about the significance of this ruling today in terms of proving that the law was racist.
Thank you for having me tonight and for raising this issue, the awareness of this issue. In the last decade in North Carolina, the Republican majority, which was a supermajority for the vast majority of that decade, has sought to entrench its power by excluding people from the ballot box, particularly voters of color and specifically African-American voters. Those tools become incredibly powerful, as we've seen in North Carolina and across the nation in these tight elections, in these politically wrought times. But this state court did what federal courts before it have done in redistricting cases and voter suppression cases in North Carolina and said, you may not target Black voters because of how they vote. That violates the equal protection guarantees of the North Carolina Constitution.
And State Senator Robinson, this is the second time in 5 years that North Carolina has had a voter ID law struck down as unconstitutional. This is from the News and Observer. This comes after a previous attempt by GOP lawmakers in 2013 to enact a different voter ID law, and that was also struck down as unconstitutional in 2016. The 2016 court ruling said North Carolina Republican lawmakers had targeted Black voters with almost surgical precision in the way the law had been written. The ruling laid out a detailed account of the history of discriminatory voting laws against Black voters in North Carolina. What is your reaction to this ruling? Is this law just another in the line of essentially racist laws that they're trying to put into place to block ballot access for Black voters?
Well, Zerlina, absolutely. What I have seen during my 11 years in the legislature has been constant attempts to suppress the rights of African Americans to vote, because they do vote Democratic mostly, but also because people understand their rights and understand the need to get to the ballot box and to vote. And so these voter ID laws and the statistics have shown that before 2018 or even before then, the majority of the people who did not have the government issued IDs were African Americans, were elderly, were poor, had issues in terms of those things. So they knew to target African Americans to keep them from getting to the ballot box, to keep them from voting for Democrats, and to keep them from exercising their rights. So this is just a constant battle in North Carolina, and I'm really proud of the court's ruling today.
And Allison, the judges actually criticized the unusual passage of this bill. Do you think that, the fact that Republicans in these state houses are ramming these laws through, do you think more courts and more judges like this one are going to recognize the intention behind these bills because of the way they actually are passed?
Well, I think what should be reassuring to all of us is the court in our case, Holmes v. Moore, looked at and examined in careful detail every fact of this particular voter ID law. So it isn't a reaction to waves of voter suppression across the South. Those exist and they're a real threat. But this opinion today, in 100 pages of factual findings, examined the way in which a lame duck legislature that had lost power and would be subject to a governor's veto pushed through an unnecessarily strict voter ID law in 8 days in a lame duck session, and admitted that a constitutionally comprised legislature elected under districts that weren't racially gerrymandered would never pass a law this strenuous. So yes, the process was rushed and abnormal. We are seeing it in other places, but this opinion was properly constrained to the facts in front of the court.
Helpful to understand that. And State Senator Robinson, in the last minute here, you testified at trial about how some amendments were rejected that would have allowed more forms of voter ID to be accepted, like public assistance, and make the bill a little bit more palatable. Why don't Republicans go along with those kinds of ideas? They're always okay with gun licenses being able to allow you to vote, but not your college ID or, in this case, the suggestions that you had?
But certainly, I think it's evident that there was absolutely attempt, and their intent was not to allow any amendments, not to allow any opportunity, because usually with legislation like this, we have plenty of time for debate, for public input, to hear from citizens and to get amendments through. But they're rushing this through. Was their intent to make sure that they pushed it through quickly, to make sure that they still had the supermajority. So then the governor, did not have the power to veto these bills, et cetera, and that they would be able to handle this before the next election took place, since the courts had already ruled that, of course, the districts were unconstitutional. So this is what happened, and it was a travesty for us, but thank goodness for the courts.
The courts are the institution that is holding, at least in some instances, North Carolina Senator Gladys Robinson and Allison Riggs. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and please have a great weekend. Coming up, some conservative Supreme Court justices are complaining that they are viewed as political hacks. And so we will have a refresher on the origin story of several of our recent additions to the Supreme Court. Melissa Murray and Brian Fallon will join us next.
This is Jialin Yang. I'm the national editor at the New York Times. I want to take a minute to speak about the incredible force behind everything we publish. I'm talking about our journalists. There are more than 1,700 of them at the Times, and I know enough of them to tell you that these are some of the most caring, diligent, and thoughtful people you'll ever meet. Some of them have wanted to be journalists since they were kids. Others first practiced as doctors, or trained as lawyers, or joined the military before bringing their expertise to the reporting they do today. They come from all over, from Iraq to Iowa. They speak Arabic, Spanish, Korean. But there's one thing they all have in common. They've dedicated their lives to helping us understand the world. I'm honored to call these people my colleagues because everything the New York Times publishes starts and ends with their commitment. If you're a Times subscriber, you provide the support that keeps our journalists focused on their stories. So thank you. If you're not a subscriber yet, you can become one at nytimes.com/subscribe.
Tomorrow marks 1 year since the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Within hours of her passing, and with only 6 weeks until the 2020 election, then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said this in a statement: President Trump's nominee will receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. That move was quite ripe with hypocrisy, because you'll recall back in 2016, Senator McConnell blocked the consideration of Merrick Garland, who was nominated with 8 whole months remaining in President Obama's second term. He blocked the nomination because he said it was too close to a presidential election. After Trump was elected, the Supreme Court seat was filled by conservative Neil Gorsuch. And the conservative line was, well, it was appropriate for conservative Antonin Scalia's seat to be filled with a conservative. And when liberal Ruth Bader Ginsburg died literally weeks before the election, none of that reasoning applied. I know you're shocked. President Trump, who promised to name Supreme Court justices who would oppose abortion rights, he literally said that on the campaign trail, he nominated Amy Coney Barrett, who was confirmed just 1 week before the 2020 election. Again, remind you that Donald Trump lost. Justice Barrett was introduced at an event last week by Senator McConnell, the very politician who rammed her nomination through the Senate before a presidential election. She said this: "My goal today is to convince you that this court is not composed of a bunch of partisan hacks." Well, Justice, we're not convinced. You need more people. Justice Barrett once signed a letter calling for the end of the barbaric Roe v. Wade. And 1 year after the death of RBG, the Supreme Court, with 6 justices nominated by Republican presidents, just straight up refused to block a Texas law prohibiting almost all abortions in that state. And joining us now is Brian Fallon, co-founder and executive director of Demand Justice. Also with us is Melissa Murray, law professor at NYU and an MSNBC contributor. And I'm just really excited for this panel because I love you both. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas also spoke out this week to say that the court isn't political. I don't mean to laugh, but he said the justices are not ruling based on personal preferences and suggested that the nation's leaders should not allow others to manipulate our institutions when we don't like the outcome that we don't get the outcome that we like. Brian, are they protesting just a little too much here? I mean, we were not born yesterday.
I think they're trolling us, Zerlina. I think justices like Alito and Clarence Thomas and now Justice Barrett, too, know full well the havoc politically that they would be wreaking by allowing this statute, this anti-abortion statute in Texas to stand. And now they're going on a goodwill tour, attempting to put the genie back in the bottle, claiming that the court is not political. Well, the public is starting to call BS on this, and it's far overdue. And I this doesn't pass the laugh test for these conservative justices to be out there. Literally, Justice Barrett gave this speech that you're referencing at an institute in Kentucky named for Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell literally introduced her. So she is standing alongside the man who has threatened to blockade any future Biden picks, and then claiming that justices are not political actors. I mean, come on. The only thing that's surprising to me is that a lot of mainstream media outlets continue to gullibly report these claims by these justices at face value, and that we have liberal justices like Justice Breyer mouthing the same talking points on his book tour. He's got a whole book out right now claiming that the court needs to still be viewed as an apolitical institution, and assertions otherwise are just off base. And I think those claims by Justice Breyer, while well-intentioned, are just belied by rulings like the one in Texas. And I think that the public increasingly sides with the view of people like Justice Sotomayor, who in her dissent said that this ruling showed a fundamental disregard for the rule of law. That's what's going on here. The curtain is being pulled back, and the conservative justices are going to get their comeuppance, I think, with a public that increasingly disapproves of the Supreme Court as an institution. There's just a poll that came out 2 days ago that showed that the court's approval rating is at a low that we haven't seen in decades.
And to that point, Senator Mitch McConnell, he already said he's going to block any nominee that President Biden puts forward before 2024. And we'd have to, quote, wait and see, right? So it seems to me that it's Senator McConnell who is being quite open about the politicization of the Supreme Court. The justices don't need to tell us otherwise. We can just watch what Senator McConnell is doing, right, Melissa?
I think that's right. I think the public has seen what's going on. We've had 5 Republican nominated justices who were nominated by presidents who failed to win the popular vote. That adds more fuel to the fire that the Supreme Court is a counter-majoritarian institution. It's a counter-majoritarian institution by design. But the idea that minority votes can actually then go on the Supreme Court and actually influence policy really rankles at this point. And to have the justices stand before us and say that there is nothing political going on when we all saw what happened on September 1st in Texas really feels a little bit like jurisprudential gaslighting. And Brian is exactly right. The Quinnipiac poll that came out last week showed the justices in the court with the lowest rating that it has ever had since the Quinnipiac poll began asking the public about its views of the court. And that began in 2004. So this is the lowest rankings it's ever had at this point. And it's not surprising, given that showing that the justices are now out on this erstwhile goodwill tour.
In the last minute here, I want to turn to Texas. A federal judge has denied a temporary restraining order on that abortion law, except they're not saying that the abortions that are performed while the law is blocked, they're not going to come back to that later. Brian, is that alarming, right? Is this decision by the court at all alarming, in addition to the Supreme Court decision, which went right to the heart of Roe v. Wade in the first place?
Well, Melissa, could you probably speak to this better than me? My understanding is that there's some folks that think that there's some strategy behind the district court judge's ruling here because to grant the temporary restraining order will allow Texas to appeal this to the Fifth Circuit more quickly. But the fact of the matter is, you're right. As I understand it, the women in Texas that are at risk of not being able to find places that will offer abortions because the law remains in effect. Anybody that is helping those people still try to obtain abortions is still going to remain liable as long as the law is allowed to stand. That just shows the urgency for Democrats in Congress to react to this in a bolder way than we're seeing so far. Yes, we need a Women's Protection Act passed, but we also need a proposal that directly addresses the judiciary that is creating all these problems and encouraging these red states like Texas to pass these restrictive laws.
Melissa, I wish we had more time, but we don't. And so I'm going to follow the directions. Melissa Murray and Brian Fallon, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was great to have you and to get your help in understanding this new ruling. Coming up, we need to talk about the things we don't talk about when we talk about COVID-19, starting with the thousands of children in America who have lost parents. In some cases, both of their parents to the COVID-19 virus. We're going to talk about that up next. By now, you're probably familiar with the COVID headlines that we hear every single day. Cases are rising in 22 states. The COVID death toll across the country has gone up by an average of 12% in just the last week. And today, an FDA panel approved Pfizer booster shots only for those who are 65 years or older or are at high risk of severe COVID-19. But tonight, we're going to talk to you about a COVID headline that you really don't hear about often. There's an orphan crisis in the United States. And no, that's not a line out of a Charles Dickens novel. It's America in 2021. It's what the CDC calls the hidden pandemic. Nearly 120,000 children across this country have lost a parent or a primary caregiver to COVID-19, and that's according to the CDC. The United States ranks fourth in the world with the most kids orphaned by COVID deaths, only behind Mexico, Brazil, and India. And children of color? They're being more disproportionately affected. Black children are about 14% of this country's population under the age of 18, but they're 20% of all children who've lost a parent to COVID-19. Children of color are also more likely than white children to be diagnosed with disabilities that require special attention and caregiving, making the loss of those adults who care for them especially tragic. This newborn is one of the 120,000 children whose parents have died of COVID-19. And so are her 4 siblings. All of them are under the age of 7. Her mother, who was unvaccinated, was hospitalized with COVID when the doctor delivered the baby. She never got to meet her youngest child before she died of COVID-19, and days later, the dad also died. Before dying, he encouraged the family to get vaccinated for COVID, and the 5 children are now being taken care of by their grandparents. With so much discussion in the past year and a half about the impact of learning loss for young children after a year of remote learning, perhaps we need to also bring our attention to the crisis of their loss of love and family members. Joining us now is Dr. Ebony Hilton, an MSNBC medical contributor and associate professor of anesthesiology and critical care medicine at the University of Virginia Healthcare Systems. Also joining us, Renee Graham, opinion columnist and associate editor at the Boston Globe. Also, Maria Teresa Kumar, president and CEO of Voto Latino, and also an MSNBC contributor. So, Dr. Hilton, I want to start with you. 1 in 500 Americans have died of COVID-19. But the racial breakdown is actually much worse than that. So the numbers break down like this. 1 in 1,300 white Americans have died of COVID, but 1 in 480 black Americans have died, and 1 in 390 Hispanics have died of COVID-19. Speak to how the racial breakdown is an important aspect of how this pandemic is disproportionately impacting people of color and children whose parents are dying.
Right. And we know the reasons why. There's nothing genetically different or abnormal about racial minorities in America. But what we do know is that historically there have been things that push us into those high risk categories, literally because of where we eat, sleep, work, and play. If you're looking at who were infected early on in the pandemic, when the rest of us were allowed to shut down and go to these Zoom meetings as our norm, the essential workers were forced to go out and get exposed to COVID-19 to keep our nation afloat. And those essential workers were largely made up of Black and brown persons. And what we're seeing even with our children, if you look at who's at risk, we're looking at those children that are predominantly in those Republican-led states, specifically in the South. And we know that 55% of all African Americans live in the South. And what we also know is that if we're looking at school districts, although we had Brown versus Board of Education that said that separate but equal was not constitutional, what we do know is that segregation of schools are now more prevalent than they were 2 decades ago. And what we also know is that the top wealthiest 10% of the wealthiest school districts spend 10 times the budget of those of the 10% of the poorest schools. And what does that lead to? Poor ventilation. It leads to overcrowding of the schools, which leads to increased risk of our Black and brown children being infected with COVID-19 if there's a chance for an outbreak. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that Black and brown children are 3 to 5 times more likely to die from COVID than if they're white. And that is simply unacceptable because we know that even death is not the only consequence of COVID-19, but permanent longstanding disability in the form of long COVID.
Yeah, that is a very important point. And Renee, you write, I don't believe mothers, fathers, or grandparents dying from COVID-19 wanted to damage their children, yet those children have been sentenced for the actions of parents and caregivers who had fears over the vaccine more than what might become of their children without the vaccine. What do you feel when you hear stories of unvaccinated parents dying when we as a country are struggling, like really struggling, especially this week, to convince folks to take this vaccine?
You know, I feel extraordinarily frustrated by this because we know this doesn't have to be happening. And what's especially heartbreaking is the impact it is having on these children. The case you were talking about earlier, where a young couple in their 30s in California, the mother was a nurse, but she was pregnant and didn't want to get vaccinated. And she got sick. She never lived to meet her newborn daughter. Her husband died a few weeks later, and they left 5 children behind. Like, this is an epidemic within the pandemic, and people aren't talking about it a lot. And it's been happening since the beginning of this pandemic. You know, this is not going to change. If people continually decide to not get vaccinated, this isn't going to go away. And you can be the best parent in the world, but if you are essentially an unconscientious objector to the vaccines, you are putting your children at great peril.
And Maria, in terms of some of the reasons why children of color and parents of color are disproportionately impacted, you know, Dr. Hilton laid out some of the real world factors and the structural reasons, but part of it is the misinformation, not just misinformation in communities of color and on social media platforms or applications that they use, but also in Spanish language. Speak to this issue of misinformation that is targeting these communities specifically that are being disproportionately impacted.
I mean, sadly, what Renee just described, the mother who was a nurse who was basically didn't want to hurt her fetus because she was afraid of the vaccine. She was clearly a target of disinformation. This is disinformation that we have been able to qualify through our partnership with Media Matters. That is something that started coming about around January and February. We flagged it for the White House. We flagged it for HHS because we knew that it was going to be a problem. And sadly, you know, this mother that just gave birth and didn't hold her child was because she didn't want to hurt her child to begin with and absorbed it. What is happening right now on the internet in English and in Spanish is something that is highly orchestrated, and it's sadly targeting the most vulnerable among us. And we have to figure out, how do we create interventions? Back in June and July, Voto Latino did tons of research with Media Matters, and we found that inoculation is actually possible. We identified Latinos in high density Latino zip codes. And Zerlina, we identified those people that had low vaccination rates by just sending them a simple message that it wasn't going to get you sick, that it was not, you weren't going to miss a day of work, and that it was free. The person who saw that ad were 54 times more likely to search for get a COVID vaccine. What that tells me is that there's not enough information in communities of color. And so what we're all of a sudden relegated to is whoever gives us a message first. That may sound real based on information that we are lacking. And so interventions are critical right now. Conversations with friends and families. This piece that you're doing right now, Zerlina, you don't know how much good you're doing because it arms us with the right information so that when we see our loved ones, we can say, hey, look, this is actually what's really happening. And there are forces out there on the dark web that are trying to harm us. And it's something, sadly, that has been historic in our history. And now it's taken to a whole new level because it is rooted in white supremacy. So we need to make sure that we're speaking very clearly to these individuals and to our loved ones. I had to have that conversation with my mother. My mother works in the healthcare field. And sadly, it took me 7 weeks before she finally took the shot. But you know what? We were finally able to spend some time with her and her grandchildren after a year and a half. It's all the difference.
That's amazing. I love that you were able to convince her, and I hope that folks at home keep the faith because they may be able to convince their family members. Don't give up on those skeptical family members. You want them to be healthy and safe. Dr. Ebony Hilton, Renee Graham, and Maria Teresa Kumar, thank you so much for staying up late on this Friday night and for joining us. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. That is tonight's last word. I'm Zerlina Maxwell. You can watch my show, Zerlina, weeknights at 6 p.m. Eastern on The Choice from MSNBC. And you can stream The Choice from MSNBC exclusively on Peacock.
Wake up to written perspectives that go beyond the headlines with MSNBC Daily, a free newsletter that delivers enlightening articles straight to your inbox every morning. Subscribe now for free at msnbc.com/daily.